Shalom, welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Chabad House of Delmar, and we have a very special guest with us today, Rabbi Avraham Laber of Congregation Beth Tefillah in Troy, New York. Welcome to the Jewish View.
Thank you, Rabbi Simon. Glad to be here.
We're going to be talking about actually a new book, so it's not just a book review, which of course has to do with Jewish people, which sometimes we like doing here on the Jewish View. But more importantly, Rabbi Laber actually was one of the researchers for this book, so therefore we have almost direct input how the book was made and some of the research behind it. And if you can see it, this is called, it's a brand new book, Rescued from the Reich, How One of Hitler's Soldiers Saved the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and it's by Brian Mark Rigg, and he also authored Hitler's Jewish Soldiers. But we want to deal with this book actually. First time I saw it, I was reading Hitler's Jewish Soldiers. I saw Rabbi Laber's name in there, and of course I know him. I said, hey, your name's in the book. There, you're in the introduction. He says, yes, I was part of the research. So even maybe for both books, how did the scholar, I mean, he's a big scholar, this Brian Riggs, how did he get a hold of you and Troy, and why, and what was your input?
Thank you. My involvement in the subject really began in 1990. One day I was in the New York Public Library, big library in Manhattan, and I was doing some research, and I noticed someone using a screen, one of those old machines, to view newspapers. And I noticed a man, it didn't look Jewish, and he had on a screen a photograph from an old newspaper of the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, arriving in America. And I was wondering, what does this man have to do with it? And I stopped him and I asked him, what are you doing? I know a lot about this man, and I'm curious, what is your research? It turns out this man was a German, and he was doing a study that was being funded by the German government. His name was Winfried Meyer. And what he was researching was that they had in the German archives, it was recorded that there were some German officers who were instrumental in saving the Lubavitcher Rebbe and getting him out of Poland. At the time, I really didn't know anything about it, but that perked my interest, and I started researching to find out what did really happen. This man, Mr. Meyer, he went on and he printed a book, and he included a chapter about the rescue. That was the beginning of it. I gathered some documents from sources in New York, and it was years later that Mr. Rigg contacted me.
Because of that initial, because he knew from this Winford person?
He had read about that. He read his book.
Yeah.
He was interested in the subject, so he contacted me in 1997 at first. That's how it began. He even visited twice, once in 1997, the second time in 2002. So that's how it all began.
So he was a contact of a contact,
right.
How you
now, about my involvement in the book, I wouldn't say that I was one of the authors of the book at all. It was the work of Mr. Rigg. However, I had some input and I explained different things and went through some of the details. However, it's important to understand where he was coming from. What was his topic of research? What was he looking for, and how did he get involved? He really started, as you see from his first book, the one that you read, his research was on Mishling. He wanted to know about half-Jews, the so-called half-Jews, people who weren't halachically Jewish. In other words, they didn't have a Jewish mother, but they were, according to Hitler's laws, they were partially Jewish, 50% or 25%. And his research was on soldiers in the German army who were Mishling. That's how he got involved in this, because some of the players in the rescue were indeed from this type of Mishling. So that's how he got involved, and he followed the trail until he found some of the people involved in the research. And eventually, he formed it into a book.
And then he took upon the new book, this about the rescue of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. I mean, one thing led to another once he was reading about this.
Correct.
Usually you say Jews and Nazis just don't mix over here. You know, a Nazi sees a Jew, they kill them. And here, you know, like I say, he's like they took in Jewish soldiers into the Nazi, army. And here, you know, one of the top Jewish leaders, the Nazis, actually helped us. You know, I mean, it sounds like it's a nice, interesting.
Right. It's a very
idea
catchy
here.
title, I'd say.
Yeah.
But bear in mind that these people, the people who are called Jewish, they were not Jewish by Jewish law, for the most part, and they definitely did not consider themselves Jewish. They were well assimilated into German society.
Some of them probably did have Jewish mothers, though. I mean, the odds are.
There may be several, but not, at least not the ones involved in the rescue.
Of the Lubavitcher Rebbe.
Yeah.
They were involved because they felt for something, or why were they picked? You say they weren't Jewish-minded, but I mean, why were they picked? They must have felt something.
Well, let me.
Yeah.
I guess we have to go back to the beginning.
Right. That's a good way.
How did this
place to
rescue
begin.
come about? Well, the Rebbe and his family and his close followers, they were in Poland when the war broke out. And at first they were in a little village called Atwatsk, or Atowak.
It's a suburb.
A suburb of Warsaw. And suddenly the war broke out, and there was a lot of confusion. What do you do? The yeshiva, the Chabad school, was headquartered in that place, Atwatsk. And immediately the yeshiva stopped. People didn't know what to do. Some students went home. And in a few days, the Rebbe and his family were transferred to Warsaw, the big city, hoping probably from there to immediately continue on.
They were transferred by who? By themselves, the Hasidim, or the government? I mean.
Well, actually, Rabbi Schneerson. Sorry. The Rebbe, although he was living in Poland, was not a Polish citizen. As you know.
From Russia, I mean.
Okay, well, the Rebbe Lubavitch began in Russia. In 1928, the Rebbe was expelled from Russia. And where did he go? He went to Riga, Latvia. And there he became a Latvian citizen. After being there for a short time, just a few years, he decided to go to Poland. But he retained his Latvian citizenship. So when the war broke out, and the first step was to get him out of Atwatsk, the first step, well, they had to get him to Warsaw. And they got help from the Latvian embassy.
Because he could be reconciled
because
back
he
to
was
his
a
original
citizen of Latvia. So that helped, at least initially, to get him to Warsaw. But once he was there, however, things got a lot more difficult. Every day, it became more and more difficult to leave Warsaw.
The Nazis took over already. I mean, they did such a blitzkrieg. They were so fast. They already took over, or was it still the Poland people were? I don't know exactly how much time it took, but for the Germans to take over to Warsaw.
It was really only a few days, a matter of days, and I think it was October 5th was already a victory march through Warsaw, and Hitler himself was there. So there was Hitler in Warsaw, the Rebbe in Warsaw, and the danger was grave already.
Yeah, surely.
And here, the Hasidim, the Rebbe's followers in New York, they knew how urgent the matter was. In fact, Rabbi Jacobson, who was the leader of Agudas Siri Chabad, of the Chabad movement in America, he had just been in Poland a few days before the war. He brought a group of American yeshiva students to go visit the Rebbe. And they were there when the war broke out. The Rebbe instructed them to immediately leave from Atvatsk to Riga, and from there to the U.S. Rabbi Jacobson led those students back, and immediately he became very active in getting the Rebbe out of there. How would they do it though? Here, there's Hasidim in New York. They want to do everything they can, but they're across the ocean. How are they going to do it? Well, they had to accomplish two things. They had to get the Rebbe out of Warsaw, hopefully to get him to Latvia, and that's one step. The second step would be to secure his passage to America, to get to safe ground. Now, both steps were difficult. To get out of Warsaw was difficult, especially since the Rebbe at the time wasn't so mobile. He was confined to a wheelchair. It was hard for him to get around. The trains were bombed, which made it very difficult to travel. So here they had to overcome these difficulties. How would they do it? Well, they got together in New York and they decided that they need people working on this full time. And for this, Rabbi Jacobson made a trip to Washington. And there was a friend of one of the New York leaders, whose name was Sam Kramer. He was one of the leaders of Chabad, and he was a successful attorney. And he had a friend in Washington, whose name was Max Rode. And they decided to hire him because he knew the ropes in Washington. He would know what to do, who to contact, and everything that would have to be done. So this began in October, or actually the end of September already. They started working on this. Mr. Rode got on the case and started working towards the rescue, which would include, first step was to locate the Rebbe. They're in New York. How do they get a message to the Rebbe? How do they find out where he is? If they want to make contacts to somehow get him out of Warsaw, they have to know where he is. They have to locate him. They didn't have clear communication anymore. All communication was cut off because of the war. So that was one great difficulty. And they also need cooperation. How would they get him out of Warsaw? And that is one of the subjects of the book, Rescued from the Reich, of how do they get out of Warsaw? And it is truly a remarkable story. Now I can't go into all the details of the story, but regarding the book, though, what I would say that there are some points of the book which I believe are make the book something very worthwhile, and some points that I commend. For example, I think one of the accomplishments of the book was uncovering the background of the main officer, the one who he calls Jewish. His father was Jewish. His name was Ernest Bloch, and he was the one who was brought in, who was appointed to actually escort them out of Warsaw. And Mr. Rigg uncovered documents about his background, and his status, and his entire history. And I believe that was a great accomplishment. But how would they? How did it begin? How would they make contact to be able to get him out of Warsaw when Warsaw is taken over by the Nazis? Well, it started from America. Mr. Rabinowitz, Oscar Rabinowitz, who was from a family of Hasidim. He made contact with the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, and eventually that led to contact with a man by the name of Robert T. Pell, and he was in charge of the European affairs of the American government, and he had a contact in the German government his name was Wolthat, Helmut Wolthat. And this Wolthat had known Mr. Pell from time that he was in America, and also from various meetings, the famous 1938 Evian Conference. They met each other there. And at the time, Mr. Wolthat mentioned to Mr. Pell that if the government is interested in a particular individual, he would do his best to help. Now, people in the government knew about that, and they contacted him to use that influence to reach Mr. Wolthat and see what he could do about rescuing the Rebbe. Now, Mr. Wolthat came from a military background, but he really wasn't a military officer. He was more into the economics. He would travel sometimes. He would give tours of factories and things. But he was also on the staff of another organization, and that was called the Abwehr. The Abwehr was the German counterintelligence agency. And they had existed even before Hitler came to power. And it was led by a man called Wilhelm Canaris. Now, Mr. Canaris headed the spy agency for many years, even before the Second World War. And at the same time, he ran his own organization. It was a little bit, somewhat independent from the Hitler's SS and other agencies. There were a lot of agencies within the Nazi government. But this particular agency, the Abwehr, was probably one of the most independent. Because it already existed beforehand, they didn't mess with it as much. And Mr. Canaris wasn't, so to say, willing to go along with everything that Hitler wanted. On one hand, he was committed to his job, but there are indications that he didn't approve of everything. He didn't believe in the way the war was being conducted, the way the war opened. He didn't believe that they would win. He had a lot of information. He didn't agree with the war tactics. And there was this man, Canaris, that Wolthat contacted. And he asked for his help. He said, what could we do? Would you be able to help with this? Well, Canaris, probably because he wasn't 100% with the Nazi plan, he had on his staff, he had some people who were these Mischling. He had some people on his staff who had some Jewish blood, so to say.
Yeah.
Right. And these people, they had special documents that were signed by Hitler himself to authorize them and to say that they're good, they're okay.
Leave them alone.
Right. And he decided that the best people to involve in the rescue would be some of these so-called half-Jews. And that's where Mr. Blach came in, where I mentioned that Mr. Rigg, did research on the background of...
But that was my original question. Did they pick him specifically because he was part Jewish, or because they said, oh, here's a part Jewish guy, let him take care of the rabbi, that's Jewish, or there was never
Probably.
that link?
It was never stated, but it's understood that he'd probably be more trustworthy.
Yeah.
Bear in mind that there was danger in this mission.
Even for the Nazis, you mean, it was for this major block it was? Why was it dangerous for him? I mean, he was sent.
Okay. Well, for Mr. Blach, I'd say there probably wasn't as much danger as there was for other officials. For example, for Mr. Wolthat, and even for Canaris. I mean, he was the head of the agency.
And so they were kind of undermining the whole Nazi structure. I mean, it was like an underground kind of thing behind the... Not underground, but behind the table, rescuing the Rebbe. And it wasn't so official, from the highest echelons. That's what these people kind of did it themselves from their own.
Well, it was official in that organization at the time, but they were also there trying to shield it from the Gestapo.
Oh, that's interesting.
So while they're doing the rescue, they're trying to make sure not to attract attention to it,
Yes, I see.
because they knew that if they get involved, they could ruin it all. So that was one of the challenges, how to keep it secret and at the same time to do an effective rescue. So these are the main players where it all started. So, however, I do believe that the title is a little bit misinformed me, because, it says one of Hitler's soldiers, rescued the Rebbe. It would make it sound as if he did it all the way on his own,
Yeah.
as if it would be a soldier who defied orders and said, well, I'm going to break the ranks and I'm going to rescue this rabbi. That's not exactly what happened. He was actually given orders to go and escort them from Warsaw to Germany, and then ultimately to Riga, where it was safer.
So you did a good research in it. What are the few things in the last few minutes that we have at the end that you disagree with his research?
What I disagree with the research was, as far as, number one, who are the heroes? He portrays the heroes as Mr. Blach as being a main hero, where I would say that many others are greater heroes. Mr. Wolfat, for example, who was constantly involved. Even Mr. Rode is constant involvement back and forth. There also there's a focus in the book which is not accurate about the involvement of the Chabad movement. It takes a sort of a grim view of the involvement of the Chabad movement and says that they were not as influential as they really were, and not as active. For example, he claims in the book that the Chabad organization failed in paying the lawyer for doing all his work, and which is simply not true. From the documents, have it in the documents very clearly that while he was paid a little bit late, the lawyer was paid $150 every week for his work, which went for more than 3 months. And this is besides all the expenses. That was just for his fee for his work. And another part of the book which I found disturbing was when it comes to, once the Rebbe got to America, what he did or didn't do to save other Jews. He takes a stand in the book minimizing Chabad's rescue of the students who were stuck in Europe. However, they did really a lot more than what's recorded in the book, according to the documents that we have. He just apparently didn't do well enough research on that part of it. Just to give one quick example, he quotes a letter of the Rebbe where he says that they raised $5,000 to save the students and get them out of Europe. And he continues, we need a few more $100. And he claims in the book, well, this was the extent of the funds to rescue the students. When you look closer, when you really look at the letter, at the original, what the letter really says is that the Rebbe explains that they have 36 students, and they've already bought tickets for them, each one costing between $450 and $500, which is a total of more than $16,000 that they already sent to get these students out. Then at the last minute, they received a telegram from Russia, from an embassy, that everything will be put on hold unless they come up with an additional $5,000. And this is where the Rebbe wrote in the letter the difficulty that he had to borrow so much money to secure and send it within 2 days to get to the Moscow bank an additional $5,000. So there was really a lot more
into it
that went into it, and you can't just take it the way it is in the book. So that's really what I didn't like too much about the book was sort of the downplaying of the Chabad involvement, which is simply not accurate.
In the rescue of all the European Jews, or I mean, did he talk about the Rebbe's involvement in saving other Jewish people, or?
Well, that's another claim that he has in the book. He questions whether the Rebbe did enough, whether he was able to do everything he could to save Jews. But as the documents show, the Rebbe did his most to save even his family and his close students. These students were like the Rebbe's children. They left their homes from Poland only on the Rebbe's word. The Rebbe instructed them to get out of Poland, and they're all on the Rebbe's responsibility. That was his first charge. He had to get those students out and their families, and even in that, he couldn't do as much as...
Yeah.
Right. Some of the Rebbe's own family ended up dying by the Nazis because they couldn't get them out. So to question why the Rebbe didn't do more, it was simply out of his hands.
Yeah, surely it was almost an impossible situation in any case. I mean, how many people did any organization get out of there? So, all right, so very good. I'm glad that we have a local scholar here, Rabbi Laber. Here it's a national book, and they relied, the author, much on the research of Rabbi Laber. Again, it's Rescued from the Reich, how one of Hitler's soldiers saved the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he's also, like we talked about, the author of Hitler's Jewish Soldiers. This is an interesting book. I mean, like I say, certain things that Laber helped him on, he agrees with the conclusion. Certain things, maybe the author will just have to write another book with some more conclusions, or you'll have to tell him, to tune up his research. Did you tell him that on the final minute that we have? Did you talk to him afterwards, after the book, and saying, the way you didn't appreciate the slant, a few things, or you got a few things maybe you should research a little bit more?
Yeah, well, he even came here and he spent time with me, and I went through a lot of things. There were a lot of things that he did fix.
This is we didn't even get into it. I mean, these are all the documentation. I mean, you can see it's so big, thick of a, I'm looking at hundreds and hundreds of pages, literally, about, this is the research of 1940, how to get the Rebbe out of. So Rabbi Laber not just knows a few stories about the Rebbe. I mean, that's all we can listen to right now. We only had a few minutes in our short little program, but there's just showing you this. We want to bring it here is this incredible amount of documentation that went into his research and what he was trying to relate to this Riggs. He talked to you, he came here and talked to you.
Right, for several days he stayed here, and I gave him my comments. Some of them he took, and some he apparently didn't. So I commend him for bringing about interest into the subject. Definitely creates awareness, and more people will follow the subject, and I believe there's a lot to study on it. However, I don't agree with some of the major conclusions of his research on the book.
Right, well, you should write an article, and that would be good to write it up. At least what we had here, so we had First Claims here to hear the official critique of the Brian Riggs book, and I want to thank Rabbi Laber for joining us on the Jewish View, just to hear some give and take about this interesting book about Jewish life. Thank you.
You're welcome.